40 people here, so I think we're ready to go. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. And thank you all for dragging yourselves away from the trial going on in the Senate, which I'm sure many of us have been glued to for the past few days. My name is Patrick Alexander. I'm sorry, I'm looking in the, see where I am.
I think I can see this.
I see me. I'm Patrick Alexander. I'm the author of, you have to plug your own books at these things. The Book Lover's Guide to Wine. And for the past dozen years, I've been teaching wine appreciation classes here in South Florida. Most recently and most enjoyably at the Coral Gables Museum. And obviously for the past year, because of the coronavirus, we've been doing it through Zoom. So this evening's presentation is part of the museum's wine appreciation course. But in fact, this evening we'll be talking very little about wine. We will refer to it a bit. We'll leave those people in the waiting room for a moment. And then when they come in, we can make fun of them. When I was a child going to Catholic church, the priest always would stop the mass to make fun and humiliate the people who came, which is usually my family, who came in late for mass. So we can do the same. So this evening we're focusing on love, and we will be drinking a little bit of wine, but not talking about wine that much. I'm thinking of maybe a future class where we'll do the opposite. We'll all be making love and talking about wine. There's a few little details to work out before we get there. So tonight, let's start off with talking about wine. Let's pour some. Hopefully you've already started. I'm about to start now. I recommended 3 different white wines to start with. I'm having a Gewurztraminer from Alsace, but I also recommended a Torrontés or an Albarino for a romantic evening. The Torrontés, for those of you who've managed to find it, is grown at about well over 10,000, maybe 15,000 feet in the northern part of Argentina, in the Andes, very close to the border with Bolivia. And therefore it's close to the equator, very, very hot. So during the day, the temperatures reach 100 degrees or more, but at nights, because of the great height, 15,000 feet up in the Andes, drops down to 40 or 30 degrees. And for whatever reason, this dramatic change in temperature throughout the day gives the Torrontés from Argentina its most unique taste. The other wine I suggested maybe would be the Albarino from Galicia in northwestern Spain, just above the Portuguese border. This is something that was brought by monks from Cluny in the Middle Ages when they were doing the walking, the pilgrimage to Compostela. And so it's got a romantic background to it. But what all 3 of these wines that I suggested share is a very high floral bouquet, particularly the Gewurztraminer from Alsace. Alsace is that region of France on the border of Germany, which swaps backwards and forwards throughout the years, but always produces excellent wines. To me, the Gewurztraminer, it's like bringing a bouquet of flowers into a room. And that's why I think it's so appropriate for Valentine's evening. It's like the Torrontés, like the Albarino, it's very romantic. So cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Welcome. Now, I think you all know the lovers that I've chosen for this evening. Well, come on, we'll let some of them in, shall we? They're out there in the, but we can make fun of them when they come in. Hopefully that's everybody in now. By the way, you are all muted. I hope that you're able to chat amongst yourselves, either directly on a personal level or as a group. But because I can't walk and chew gum at the same time, I'm not able to read the chat. So you can't get hold of me that way. What I will do when I finish the presentation is unmute you all, and then you can ask questions or throw empty bottles, well, full bottles of wine at me, whatever you like. Do we have any more? Before we get going, I want to make sure the waiting room is now, the people that I've selected this evening, you might well find it's an odd selection, since most of them are very unhappy or have very unhappy endings, and there's a lot of suicide, a lot of adultery, a lot of murder, and you know, why are we doing this for a romantic Valentine's evening? My rationale here is that whatever sort of romantic relationship you yourselves might be in, after, and you might be, hopefully you're all ecstatic with the state of your romance. But for those of you who maybe, you know, got slight misgivings, after this evening and learning about other people's romantic relationships, you'll be delighted. You'll be so relieved. At least your relationship is so much better and happier than theirs. So that's my rationale for this particular selection. Let us. I'm going to lose sight of all of you. Hopefully you will be able to, you have a choice, I think, between the view of me, the speaker. There we go. I do apologize for that. Hopefully everyone is now in and we can start again. Modern technology. So we have a dozen, and again, I can't see myself, so I hope I'm looking fine. And Louise, please reassure me. It
Looking
seems like
fine.
Thank you.
Looking great.
We're starting off. We have a mixture here of real life historical characters and mythical or legendary or just purely literary characters. We start off with Tristan and Isolde, and then Lancelot and Guinevere, and these are both really obviously legendary characters from the 12th century. And there's a parallel there. They both involve threesomes. You have the husband, the king, the wife, the queen, and the best friend. Unfortunately, these ménage à trois, these threesomes end up tragically. But that's the relationship between Tristan and Isolde and Lancelot and Guinevere. Staying in the 12th century, we have more people coming in. All. I hope you're going to punish these people for being late. Staying in the 12th century, we then move on to Dante and Beatrice. The next four characters, Dante, Beatrice, Heloise and Abelard, Napoleon and Josephine, Antony and Cleopatra, are all real historical characters. There is a relationship between them all, but they are real history people. Heloise and Abelard, Napoleon and Josephine and Antony and Cleopatra were both generals. Napoleon was a general, Antony was a general. Napoleon put his duty, as he saw it, before his love for Josephine. Whereas Antony, who was the greatest general in the world at that particular time, put his, so let's say, love or lust for Cleopatra above his sense of duty. Pyramus and Thisbe, Romeo and Juliet, these are two groups of lovers who were separated not by politics, not by war, but by their families. They came from families who rival families, and that's what caused their unhappiness and ruined their love. Odysseus and Penelope, Dido and Aeneas, they are characters from the Trojan War. And both of them had tragic ending. Well, sorry, no, that isn't true. Odysseus and Penelope, they're one of the few that we discussed this evening who have a very happy ending and a happy life eventually. Dido and Aeneas, well, we'll see. But they're both results, the relationships and results of the Trojan War. And finally, we have Hero and Leander, Orpheus and Eurydice. And really, the tragedy of their love was not caused at all by their behavior or by any human intervention. It was simply unfortunate consequences of natural disasters. So let's go back to the beginning, to the Celtic story of Tristan and Isolde.
Patrick, I think there's actually somebody in the waiting room that was dropped when you changed it.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Is there anybody else? Keep me alerted if anybody, these slinky latecomers slinking in. Okay, so we're going to Tristan and Isolde. I've moved my cursor into, that's what happens when I go into the waiting room. So Tristan and Isolde is one of those old Celtic legends, and we find versions of it in the Irish literature, in Cornish literature, in Welsh literature, in French, Britannic literature. And it evolved from the 6th century to the 12th century. The 12th century it really gathered together. So the version I'm going to give you this evening is really sort of the main theme that runs through it all. And it's quite simple. As I said earlier, it's the classic ménage à trois. Isolde is a princess of Ireland, and she is betrothed to King Mark, King of Cornwall. And King Mark has his best friend, his trusted knight, Tristan. So in order to celebrate the marriage with the princess from Ireland, with the King of Cornwall, he sends over Tristan to Ireland to collect his bride and bring her back. Now, the mother of Isolde had given her daughter a magic love potion that she was to give and share with her husband when they met. And this would guarantee marital bliss. But, and there's various versions as to why. Was it accidental? Was it deliberate? We don't know. But on the boat coming over, Isolde shares the love potion with Tristan. So of course, the two of them fall madly in love. Anyway, they come to Cornwall. She marries Mark, becomes the Queen of Cornwall. Meanwhile, rumors in the court, you know, he's got young Tristan has the hots for the wife. They build up until eventually King Mark decides that he's been betrayed and he takes action. And of course, Klimt makes the very famous photograph of the two lovers. They're condemned to death. Tristan by hanging, and Isolde to be burnt at the stake. But Tristan is a great knight. So he pulls out his sword and with one bound he is free, and he gets on his horse and he gallops across and he comes to the stake and he takes Isolde and he puts her behind her on the horse and off they go. And they get away to the forest. Well, King Mark, understandably, is quite cross about this. So he gets his soldiers and they go hunting, and by good Lord, you know, what's the chance? He finds them together sleeping in the forest. But what he notices is that although they're sleeping together, there is a double-edged sword between them. And this convinces him of their innocence, that their affection might be there, but there's no carnal knowledge between them. And so he forgives them. He takes Isolde back into the palace as his queen. Obviously, he can't take Tristan back. There's too many rumors, a bit of scandal. So, but instead of having him killed, Tristan is allowed to go to Brittany, where he marries the beautiful Princess Isolde of Brittany. And then there's various stories about Tristan's life in Brittany with Isolde. various versions. Sometimes he's defending the nation, the Brittany, and is pierced by a poisoned sword. Other times, other versions have Morgan le Fay giving him a poisoned chalice. But whatever it is, he falls deadly ill, and the only possible way he can be saved is by Isolde, the Queen of King Mark, Princess Isolde of Ireland, coming to save him. So he sends a friend back to Cornwall to ask Isolde to come and do whatever magic is involved to save him from death. And he tells his friend, if she agrees to come with you, sail back and put white sails on the boat. But if you come back alone and she refuses for whatever reason to come with you, then I want you to return with black sails. So Tristan is these terrible people. Marion, you're late. You've embarrassed everybody. So Tristan is too old, he's too ill to go to the cliff tops to wait for the boat and see how it's coming back. So his wife, Princess Isolde of Brittany, she volunteers to do it for him. And sure enough, she waits a couple of days. And after a couple of days, see, this is what happens when I have to go to the waiting room. After a couple of days, she sees the boat coming back. And Princess Isolde, obviously, she loves with purity. And she's agreed to come back, and the boat has indeed got white sails. But understandably, Princess Isolde, the now wife of Tristan, is jealous. It's understandable. So she comes to his sick room and she says, "Ma chérie, I have seen the boat. It has got the sails. They are all black." And poor Tristan, heartbroken, feeling betrayed, he just gives up the ghost and dies. The boat gets in, Princess Isolde comes out, Queen Isolde comes out, and she finds Tristan dead. Now, Wagner wrote a beautiful opera, Tristan and Isolde, on a subject, and the very final aria is so extraordinarily beautiful. It's so sad. You feel all there's all the rhythms of the sea, but also the rhythms of the heart as she's broken-hearted and she's trying to convince herself that he's still alive. And finally, she acknowledges he's dead, and she dies. I'm not going to play it now, but what I will do is send you a YouTube version of it later this evening when I finish the presentation. The aria is called Liebestod, means love and death. And after they died, the two bodies were buried, but separately. But out of Tristan's grave grew a briar, a bramble. And it then went across the ground to Isolde's grave. And out of her grave came a rose bush. And the briar wrapped itself around the rose. And ever since, in Celtic lore, that has been a symbol of undying love. And here you are. And there, of course, is the two-edged sword. So we come to the Arthurian legends, and again, in the 12th century, Thomas Malory brought them together in the Morte d'Arthur, and obviously it incorporated the same theme of the threesome that it got from Tristan and Isolde. So here we have King Arthur, Queen Guinevere, and the favourite knight, Sir Lancelot. Now, there's no double-edged sword keeping these two apart. I mean, this was a passionate love affair. And King Arthur knew about it, but he turned a blind eye. It broke his heart, but nevertheless, he didn't want to disrupt Camelot. He didn't want to destroy the ethos of the Round Table. But things got to a point of extreme carnal knowledge that the rumours in the court, though Arthur was turning a blind eye, his nephew Mordred, who was always jealous of Lancelot, finally caught Lancelot in the Queen's bedchamber. And Arthur had no choice but to condemn them to death. So again, same situation. I've used actually the same illustration. Lancelot was to be hanged, Guinevere was to be burned, but again, the same story. He drew out a sword and galloped off and freed her, and they took off and got away. But unfortunately, there's no happy ending to this particular story. That was the end of Camelot. It was the end of the whole spirit of possibilities. Guinevere ended up the rest of life alone in a monastery, and Lancelot became a hermit, lost in the woods. Sad ending. Now, getting away from adultery and passion, we come to, we're still dating in real live people with we're starting with real life people with historical figures, but we're still in the 12th century. But we moved inland to Italy, to Florence, and we've got here Dante Alighieri and Beatrice Portinari. And the love affair, the love between Dante and Beatrice is almost part of the European canon. But the reality is nothing ever happened. They only met 4 times. First time when they were 9 years old as children, they met at a party, and but she had such an effect on Dante that he never forgot. So he didn't see her again until their early 20s, and then he bumped us in this famous painting by one of the English pre-Raphaelites. I can't remember his name, I'm sorry. He saw Beatrice walking along the river Arno, knew who she was, but she turned to him and smiled and said hello, buongiorno. And so, ladies, always be aware of the power that you have when you smile at a man and say hello, especially if you say it with an Italian accent. He was smitten. Dante never forgot. He did see her a couple more times in his life. 40 years later, they were at a wedding together. And they maybe waved to each other or saw each other. We don't know. And then later on, in their 60s, they were at a church. It was recorded they were at a church together. But that's it. That's a full extent of their relationship. And yet, it drove this man to produce one of the greatest works in European literature, the Divine Comedy. And through it, he used Beatrice as his inspiration. And it was her, you see her there, who guided Virgil through and explained all the mysteries of paradise. All from saying buongiorno. You never know. Always be nice. We're still staying in the 12th century. We're still staying with real historical people, Abelard and Heloise. And we're still remembering that this is a wine course. I love the bouquet of this wine. Abelard was one of the top philosophers in 12th century Paris, in 12th century Europe, actually. He was a teacher, a theologian at the Sorbonne, the university next to Notre Dame in the center of Paris, and was renowned throughout Europe for his teachings. Now, Heloise was very unusual. In those days, women didn't get any education at all. Having babies, supervising the cooking and looking after the household were the main things. Heloise, as from a young girl, and her uncle with whom she lived was Canon Fulbert, and he had control of Notre Dame Cathedral. He was in charge of Notre Dame Cathedral. So a very, very important man, dedicated to learning. And so he encouraged her to do her studies, and she read Greek, she read Latin, she was a musician. She was really, really talented at a very young age. And Abelard was fascinated and asked Canon Fulbert whether he could mentor her, whether he could become her tutor. And to that point, he moved into the house, into Canon Fulbert's house, so that he could be close to Heloise and look after her studies. Now, this has a personal meaning to me, because my eldest daughter, Peggy, for a while lived in that house. It's there on Ile de la Cité. It's 11 Quai des Fleurs on the Ile de la Cité, right next to Notre Dame. And she had an apartment on the 6th floor with a boyfriend. And this is a view from her balcony on the 6th floor. No elevator, stairs. Oh, I forgot my keys. You have to go all the way down. And when Jude and I visited her many, many years ago, we bought her a Weber barbecue so that she and her fiance could have grilled steaks on the barbecue while looking out over at Notre Dame. So many years later, when Notre Dame caught fire, and I don't want to make light of this, it was a terrible thing, but I felt a certain twinge of guilt that maybe it was an ember from my barbecue that had caused the conflagration. My daughter assures me that that is not the case. Now, like many Parisian houses or apartments, you get to your apartment from an inner courtyard. And this particular building had 2 doors. So it's 11 Quai des Fleurs. And you can hopefully go and check it out yourselves. You can see in this photograph, that is Heloise, the bust of Heloise above the door. And here above this door is the bust of Abelard. So anyway, he moves in as a tutor, and the way things go, they got closer and closer. And this caused, well, you can imagine what it caused. This was the 12th century, it wasn't the 21st century. So Canon Fulbert was furious, and rumors were going around, and eventually they were caught, and Fulbert said that's enough, and he sent Heloise off to a nunnery. And as for Abelard, let me read to you his own description of what happened to him. This is his own description that he wrote many years later. Violently incensed, they laid a plot against me. And one night, while I, all unsuspecting, was asleep in a secret room in my lodgings, they broke in with the help of one of my servants whom they had bribed. There they had vengeance on me with a most cruel and most shameful punishment, such as astounded the whole world. For they cut off those parts of my body with which I had done that which was the cause of their anger. Gentlemen, you may squirm. Heloise spent the rest of her life in a convent. Abelard continued to teach. I mean, his theological writings were still regarded with high regard, but they never saw each other again. However, they continued to write to each other. And the story was slightly known. I mean, it was a romantic tale, but Chaucer mentions it, Dante briefly mentions it, Petrarch mentions it, but it really didn't become a well-known story till the 18th century, when their love letters were discovered and published. And one of the people who read their love letters was Empress Josephine, Empress of France, wife of Napoleon. She was so moved by the romance behind this story, by the purity of their love, and the intensity of their love, which they do express in their letters, that she had the two bodies disinterred and reburied in Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, and had this beautiful tomb built. I still think it's one of the most beautiful romantic tombs in Père Lachaise. And obviously she's there, they're there with Marcel Proust and Jim Morrison and all sorts of others, but this is the tomb to visit. So a very, very romantic 12th century story. And Josephine herself, again, we're still dealing with real historical figures here. Josephine herself is worthy of being included in this evening's stories. When they married, when they met, it was a passionate love right away in 1796. And she at the time she was a widow, but she was the most fashionable, wealthy, biggest hostess in Paris. She was the Josephine de Beaumarchais, whereas Napoleon hadn't really established himself properly. He'd had a victory in Italy, but he was still one of the consuls. And the bottom line was, he was rather short. He was from Corsica, had a very thick Corsican accent, didn't really have the savoir-faire of the Parisians. And so she taught him, and she introduced him to all the salons, and she basically civilized him. And very quickly, through his own skills, he became Emperor of the French, and famously crowned himself. And then, as we can see here, he crowned her as Empress. And their love for each other was very intense, very impassionate, very physical. But he had stuff to do. I mean, he was galloping all around Europe, doing his Napoleonic things, and she was stuck at home. So he was taking lovers wherever he went, and she basically did the same back at home. But the love between them remained, even though they both knew of each other's infidelities. But we do have copies of their letters, and there was great passion between them. However, the most important thing for Napoleon was to have an heir, and she was unable to give him a son. She'd had 2 children by a previous marriage, but for whatever reason, she wasn't able to give him an heir. And therefore, despite their love, he had to divorce her in 1810, and he married the daughter of the Emperor of Austria. She was the Duchess of Parma, Marie-Louise, and eventually had a son with her, who became Napoleon II, except he didn't last very long. But he didn't discard Josephine. He made her Duchess of Navarre. He built this beautiful mansion for her, which is still there outside Paris, Château de Malmaison, and she lived there for the rest of her life, entertaining gentlemen, from emperors to generals to poets. You know, she had a wonderful life until her death, and her gentlemen visitors included Napoleon himself. She died in 1814, luckily in a way, because it was 1 year before his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. And from 1815 till 1821, when he died, he was a prisoner of the English, and we locked him up on an island in the middle of the Atlantic, St. Helena. But we have meticulous records of what went on there. And he imported from South Africa 287 gallons of Constantia wine each year. We know this because the English had to pay for the wine coming in from South Africa. And those of you who have taken my wine course might remember that the English and the Dutch planted vineyards in South Africa in order to replenish supplies for their troops going further east to the colonies in the east. But the wines of Constantia were so fabulous that they were brought back to Europe, where they were the favorite wine of King Frederick of Prussia, Empress Catherine of Russia. Jane Austen, for example, said, "Oh, the wines of Constantia are the only possible relief for a broken heart." And of course, they were the favorite wine of Napoleon. 287 gallons each year. Well, he lived quite long, but he did die in 1821. And his final words when he died were, La France, l'armée, la tête de l'armée, Josephine, France, the army, the head of the army, Josephine. That, ladies and gentlemen, is true love. Now, we move from one great general, 18th, 19th century general, to another great general, Mark Antony. But the most important figure in this story is Cleopatra. She's one of the most fascinating women who's ever lived. As Shakespeare said of her, age shall not wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Other women cloy the appetites they feed, but she makes hungry where most she satisfies. Cleopatra was the final end of all the pharaohs, going back how many years? We know all the long train of pharaohs. She was the last ruler of Egypt. She was a final pharaoh because the Romans had conquered and made Egypt a sub-kingdom within the Roman Empire. And Julius Caesar was the person who was in charge. He was not an emperor then, he was still a consul, but he was the man in charge. And she knew that he was the guy that she needed to be working with. So she had herself wrapped up in a carpet and smuggled into his quarters where, well, who could resist that? Where they fell in love. And she remained his lover until his death in 44 BC, when he was assassinated by Brutus. In fact, she had a son by him who later on helped to rule Egypt. So after he had been assassinated by Brutus, she needed another strong man to protect her. And Mark Antony was the most powerful man in the Roman Empire then. He'd been Caesar's friend, he was the most successful general, and eventually, when he was in Turkey, he summoned her to come and visit him. So she did. She sailed across the Aegean and sailed up the river to where Mark Antony was waiting in the city of Taurus in what's today southern Turkey, and made her splendid entrance. Now, in the Antony and Cleopatra play by Shakespeare, the arrival of Cleopatra is described by Enobarbus. And Enobarbus is one of Antony's top generals. And he's a man's man. He's a soldier's soldier. He's blunt, he's cynical, he uses coarse language, he doesn't have any namby-pamby nonsense, he's a soldier. So it's very interesting that Shakespeare gives this particular speech describing Cleopatra's arrival to Enobarbus. And it's his way of showing that Cleopatra, her magic, her control over everything, can enchant even a hardened, old, grumpy soldier like Enobarbus. So here's his description. He's telling a friend what it was like when Cleopatra arrived. The barge she sat in, like a burnished throne, burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were silver, which to the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water which they beat to follow faster, as amorous of their strokes. For her own person, it beggared all description. She did lie in her pavilion, cloth of gold of tissue, over picturing that Venus where we see the fancy outwork nature. On each side of her stood pretty dimpled boys like smiling cupids, with diverse coloured fans, which wind did seem to glow the delicate cheeks which they did cool, and what they undid did. At the helm, a seeming mermaid steers, the silken tackens swell with the touches of those flower-soft hands, and from the barge, a strange invisible perfume hits the sense of the adjacent wharf. The city cast its people out to gaze upon her, and Antony, enthroned in the marketplace, did sit alone, whistling to the air, which, but for vacancy, had gone to gaze on Cleopatra too, and made a gap in nature. And as if that wasn't enough, as a splendid arrival, the first evening when they had dinner, Cleopatra was famous for her earrings, which had the biggest pearls in the known world. They were famous. They were the biggest. They were the most. They were the most famous. They were the most expensive. And she took one off. And she dropped it in her wine, where it dissolved. And when it had dissolved, she drank it. That got Antony going. I don't know why, but that got him going. And for the next weeks, months, it was party time. It was wine, women, and song. He forgot all about being a general. He forgot all about looking after the affairs of the empire. He was just drinking and partying with Cleopatra. Well, of course, if you're in charge of the empire, you're not allowed to do that. And if you do, then things go wrong. And soon enough, Octavius, who was later to become Emperor Augustus, at the time he was just Octavius, got off a fleet and came to attack Antony in Egypt. So Antony finally gets together a fleet, goes off to meet Octavius, and Cleopatra comes along with him in her own boats. So they have the very, very important Battle of Actium, 31 BC. Well, Cleopatra wasn't a soldier. So when all the noise of war and the blood and the thunder start, she gets her captain to turn the boat around, and off they go, back to Alexandria. Fair enough. She wasn't a warrior. She was there just to as a cheerleader for her lover. But the shameful thing was that Antony, when he saw her leave, he turned his boats around and pursued her. Now, of course, people thought he was fleeing from the battle. He wasn't fleeing from the battle. He was chasing after his love. He'd lost it. Complete opposite of the way Napoleon was always putting his ambition and his duty ahead of him. Antony blew it all. And of course, he quickly realized, and he blamed Cleopatra, but he blamed himself. He realized what an awful thing, what a disgrace as a general that he'd brought upon himself. And Cleopatra understood that she'd blown it for him and that he was annoyed and was mad at her. So she devised this little thing. She sent word to Antony that she was going to kill herself. She was so ashamed. She was going to kill herself, and she was going to go off to the monument where she was going to do the deed. And she thought that this would make Antony rush back, and she could seduce him all over again, and everything would be hunky-dory, more parties. Well, didn't work that way. Antony was so disillusioned with himself and the fact that now Cleopatra was dead, he just decided to kill himself. He asked a friend to stab him with a sword, and his friend said, "I can't do that," and instead took the sword and killed himself. So Antony got his sword and fell on it and died. And Cleopatra, once she realized that the man she possibly loved, who knows, was dead, and that Octavia was going to take her back to Rome as a slave. She took a snake, an asp, and held it to her breast and died. No happy ending so far. I'm sure we're going to get one some point. Pyramus and Thisbe. Now, this is a very old story. Pyramus and Thisbe were Babylonians, and in fact, this is a mosaic from a floor in Pompeii. So the Romans had built this. So this was already an old legend by the time of the Romans. So we're going back to Babylon, and Pyramus and Thisbe were two young lovers, had the misfortune to be children of two rival families, and the two rival families hated each other. So the only way that Pyramus and Thisbe could communicate was through a hole in the wall. They whispered sweet nothings to each other, but as we all know, after a while, sweet nothings get a bit, we need a bit more than that. So what they decided to do was to escape and to meet up at a well, which they both knew out in the countryside nearby, and they'd meet there, and then they would take off and they'd build a life somewhere else where their silly families couldn't interfere. So Thisbe reached the well first, but when she got there, there was a fearsome lion who had just eaten an antelope, had blood all over its face, and was growling nastily, so she quite understandably fled away, got to safety. But in doing so, she dropped her shawl. And the lion wasn't that hungry, but he was curious. So he went over and he sniffed around and dripped his blood all over it. So a few minutes later, Pyramus turns up. He finds the bloodied shawl. He decides Thisbe must have been eaten by the lion. He doesn't want to live anymore. He gets his sword and kills himself. He's dead. And then a few minutes later, here comes Thisbe. She finds Pyramus. Obviously, you can see he was dressed for the meeting, but too late. He's dead. And I think you can probably all guess the way the evening is developing, what she's going to do next. Yes, she takes his sword and she kills herself. Getting quite a pile of bodies here this evening, I do, and a lot of naked breasts, I do apologize. And gentlemen's rude bits. Shakespeare took this story and he plonked it into the middle of A Midsummer Night's Dream, as you might remember. Nick Bottom, right in the middle of A Midsummer Night's Dream, Bottom, Puck had given Bottom the head of an ass, which he didn't realize. And he was putting on a play, magical play of Pyramus and Thisbe before the Duke and the Duchess of Athens, as I recall. And the major character in the play, of course, and here you see various versions of Pyramus and Thisbe being performed in the Midsummer Night's Dream, is always the wall. The wall is always the most important thing, as I think even today it may be. So we've discussed one pair of lovers coming from rival families, and now of course we come to the most famous of all, Romeo and Juliet. Now those of you who lived in Verona, those of you who've taken my wine course will remember that the wine that comes from Verona is Amarone della Valpolicella. And that's a very unique wine. Instead of picking the grapes and fermenting them, the grapes are picked early and left in trays, as you see here, to dry out in the sun. And that makes them shrivel up and concentrate. So the juices and the sugars concentrate. So when eventually the grapes, or almost raisins, are fermented, it produces an extraordinarily strong, very big bodied wine, but with very high alcohol content. It can go up to even 18%. And the thing about Verona, it's in the foothills of the Alps and the Dolomites, and surrounded by woods, surrounded by game. There's a lot of wild boar and all sorts of good game. So the Amarone is the is the perfect wine, big masculine wine for a big hearty meat dinner. So you may say, well, why for the red wines that I'm recommending this evening, why didn't I suggest Amarone? Because it's not a romantic wine. I was going to use that glass, but there's still some Gewurztraminer to be enjoyed. The wines that I recommended for this evening, the red wines, were Pinot Noir or the Primitivo. And the Pinot Noir specifically because unlike Amarone del Valpolicella, which is big and strong, has high tannins, these wines, the Pinot Noir, the Primitivo, they're smooth, they're soft, they're gentle in the mouth, and it's been Pinot Noir has been described as sex in a glass, and in Vanity Fair it was described as the most romantic of wines, with so voluptuous a perfume, so sweet an edge, and so powerful a punch that, like falling in love, they make the blood run hot and the soul wax embarrassingly poetic. So I hope this evening a few of you are waxing embarrassingly poetic with your Pinot Noir. Do we have another in the waiting room? No, I don't think so. I, however, am drinking the Primitivo. The Primitivo from southern Italy, from Apulia, the boot, if you like, of Italy. It's full-bodied, it's soft, it fills the mouth, it has a lovely bouquet, and it's my wife's favorite wine. So that's why I'm drinking Primitivo this evening. And there you see Verona, and you see the Amarone. We all know the story of Romeo and Juliet. Basically, Verona is divided between the Montagues and the Capulets. Juliet is a Capulet. Romeo is a Montague. And one evening, as young lads do, he gate crashes a party at the Capulets. And when he's there, he sees and falls in love with Juliet. And they have the balcony scene. And in fact, thanks to Friar Lawrence, they actually get married in secret. So they're now husband and wife. Nobody else knows except Friar Lawrence. But they're husband and wife. And they're, scheming away. What do we do next? Meanwhile, Verona is divided between Capulets and Montagues. They're out in the streets. It's like Antifa and Proud Boys. They're always fighting and brawling and having fights. Now, Juliet has a cousin called Tybalt, and Tybalt discovers that Romeo had gate crashed their party, and he's furious, and they meet in the street, and challenges him to a duel. Now, Romeo realizes that Tybalt is now his kinsman because he's married to Juliet. So he backs off. He can't possibly have a duel with his kinsman. But his friend, Romeo's friend, Mercutio, how could I forget Mercutio? Mercutio is embarrassed on Romeo's behalf. So he pulls out his sword and he takes Romeo's place and has to fight with Tybalt, and Tybalt kills him. At this point, Romeo, obviously shamed, angry, pulls out his sword, and he kills Tybalt, kinsman or not. So we've got two dead bodies, yet more, two dead bodies, and the government of Verona, they've had enough. All this feuding and dead bodies. So Romeo is banished. He's not allowed in Verona ever again. He moves to Mantua, which is 22 miles away. I checked it on Google Maps. Meanwhile, what to do? So Juliet Father Lawrence, they concoct this scheme where she's going to take this potion, which will make her appear to be dead for 48 hours, and then her body will be taken out to the family mausoleum outside the city of Verona, and then Romeo can come and he can collect her, and they can go off and start a new life elsewhere, probably in Mantua. So good plan. So Father Lawrence sends a messenger off to tell Romeo what the plan is, but unfortunately the messenger doesn't reach Romeo, but Romeo does hear that Juliet is dead and he's devastated. So he gets his own poison, he buys his own poison, and he gallops back to Verona, back to the tomb, the Capulet tomb, and there he finds Juliet apparently dead. So after killing one of Juliet's friends who's nearby, he drinks the poison and he dies. And Juliet wakes up, finds her dead lover, and so she reaches into his pocket, gets out his knife, and stabs herself. We're getting I think we're getting a bit low here. Let's get some happy marriages. So Odysseus and Penelope, they were happily married couple. He was king of Ithaca. She was his queen, madly in love, children together. But then, as we all know, Prince Paris from Troy came over to Greece, stole Helen, the wife of Menelaus, took her back to Troy. So all the Greek kings got together, big fleet, went off to Troy, and we had the Trojan War, which went on for God knows how many years. And finally it was settled when Odysseus had the idea of the wooden horse, took it into Troy, destroyed and killed all the Trojans, with one exception, which we'll discuss in a moment. And then when it was all over, Odysseus was coming back to Penelope, back home in Ithaca. But, and we're not going into that now, you have to read the Odyssey. It took him 10 years, all sorts of adventures, went all over the place before he got home. Meanwhile, Penelope is all alone in the palace in Ithaca, and she's got everyone saying, oh, he's dead, he's abandoned you, he's gone. You have to marry again. We need a king. And so the way that Penelope kept all the suitors off was by saying, and by the way, the suitors were eating all the food, making merry in the house, and most importantly, drinking all Odysseus's wine. He was famous for his wine collection, and they were galloping through it like nobody's business. So the way she kept them at bay was by saying, I will make a decision, I will marry one of you when I finish this shroud. So every day she and her handmaidens were weaving, they were sitting at the loom, you can see that, weaving the shroud for her dead father-in-law. But each night, when everyone had gone home, she would come down with scissors and she would cut out all the work that they'd done, so that the next day they had to start all over again. So the business of weaving the shroud continued year after year after year, until eventually, after all his adventures, Odysseus gets home in disguise, and he picks up his bow, which only he can manage, and he takes on the suitors. And he really takes them on. He kills them all, destroys the whole lot of them, and I'm very happy to say he and Penelope continued to live a long and happy and loving life together. But you may ask, why this viciousness? Why did he butcher them all like that? Very simple. They drank all his wine. Wouldn't you do the same? Dido and Aeneas. Now, I said that after the fall of Troy, that all the Trojans were killed by the victorious Greeks. However, there was one exception, and that was Aeneas. And Aeneas was the son of the goddess Venus and one of the Trojan kings. So his life was spared, but he was given a task. He was told, so after after everyone else was butchered in the Trojan War, he was given a task. He had to leave Troy, or the ruins of Troy, and he had to go to Italy to found a new city, which was to be called Rome. The gods wanted Rome. The Aeneid, by the way, is written by Virgil, the Roman poet, and this is a way of giving a romantic background and a legitimate divine legitimacy to Rome. So his job is to leave Troy, sail off and to Italy and found Rome. But in those days, just like Ulysses in the boat, they didn't have GPS. So he got lost and he ended up on the north coast of Africa in Carthage, where he met, which was a Phoenician city, where he met Dido. Dido was queen of Carthage and he was a prince of Troy, and it was immediate. They didn't even bother to get married. It was just open lust, open fun, and the Carthaginians were very, very tolerant people, so there was no problem whatsoever. And he dilly-dallied with Dido day after day after day, ignoring his quest. So the only people, the Carthaginians were quite happy about this, and Dido was very happy about this, but the gods weren't. He had a job to do. So they finally turned up and said, listen, you've got a job to do. You're on a quest. You've got to go to Italy. You've got to found Rome. You've got to start a new dynasty. And Aeneas didn't man up. He didn't tell Dido the truth. What he did when she was asleep, he got his men, he got his boats, and he took off, abandoned her, went off to found Rome. And poor Dido was left there with nothing. Heartbroken and bitter and angry, understandably. So she decided the only way to deal with this is to get all his possessions, bring them into the market square and burn them. But as she gathered all his possessions, she found his famous dagger. I know, you're ahead of me. You know what happens next. Heartbroken, she killed herself. Poor Dido. Hero and Leander. Now, Hero was a priestess, a virgin priestess, in the temple of Venus on the European side of the Dardanelles, or Hellespont. The Hellespont, or the Dardanelles, is that strip of water that runs between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, where Istanbul is today. And the Hellespont is one of the narrowest parts of it. So Hero was a priestess in Venus's temple on the European side, and the temple had a very high tower. And Leander was a poor peasant boy, a sheep herder on the Asian side in what is today modern Turkey. But each evening, when it got dark, he would take off his clothes and swim across the Hellespont to meet Dido. To meet Hero. And Hero would climb up to the top of her tower with a torch. And Leander would see the light, see the torch, and would be able to safely swim across. And so they spent the whole summer, evening after evening, in each other's company. And eventually, Leander got his way. He persuaded, because he was pointing out to Hero that, listen, you're a virgin, but you're a virgin priestess in the temple of Venus. And Venus is a goddess of love and sex. It's an insult to be a virgin. Eventually he persuaded her. So ladies, I'm sure you're aware, men will tell you anything to get their wicked way. But he did get his wicked way, and they carried on very, very happily through the summer, through the fall. But then in the winter, the storms started building up. And one night there was a terrible storm, big waves, terrible winds, and the winds blew out the torch. So poor Leander was there in the water, in the big waves, and he couldn't see where he was going. And eventually he was dashed to death on the rocks. And the next morning, Hero found him lying there on the shore, dead. Well, I think you've probably got enough pattern from this evening to know what happens next. Yes, she goes back up the tower, up to the top of the tower, and throws herself off. But they spent the rest of eternity together. And finally, our last unhappy couple. Well, they start off as very happy couple. Orpheus and Eurydice, happily married. Orpheus was the son of Apollo and a mortal woman. Again, like Aeneas, half god, half divine, half mortal. And his father, Apollo, gave him the ability to make the most beautiful music that would charm everyone. And by everyone, I mean animals, the wildest animals, and every person, living or dead. My wife has excellent taste. Eurydice was out dancing one day with the nymphs in the woods, innocently, happily away, when she was bitten by a snake. And unfortunately, it turned out to be fatal. They did everything they could to cure her. It didn't work. So she died. Her body went, she went to the underworld. But Orpheus was heartbroken and he couldn't accept this. So he decided that he would descend into the underworld to get her back, using his charm. So the first thing he had to do was cross the river Styx and charm Charon, the ferryman, to row him across, which he did with his music. Then an even worse challenge was Charybdis, the three-headed dog, which guarded the gates to the underworld. And again, Orpheus was able to charm the dog and to get through. And finally, down in the underworld, he confronted the king and the queen, Pluto and Persephone. And again, his magic worked. He was able to get mercy from the cold eyes of Pluto. And Pluto allowed him to take his wife, Eurydice, back up above to the living world on one condition. And the condition was that he was never to look back. He was to keep going until they were both up in the upper world. I can do that, Orpheus said. So he took Eurydice and they went back towards the upper world. They went past all the spirits and all the ghosts and all the sadness of the underworld, going higher and higher. And when Orpheus got to the top, back into the sunlight, back onto the world, he turned round, forgetting that Pluto had said, when you're both in the upper world. He turned round too soon, and Eurydice was taken back and he lost her. There is, however, one lesson maybe that we can get from Orpheus. Now we're in the 2021, the year 2021. Don't look back. Let's look forward. I'm sorry, because of the technical problems, my own fault earlier on, we've gone a little over time, and I do apologize. I'm now going to open up the there we go. The other thing I wanted to say was that thank you. We have been talking about selfish love, if you like, or carnal love, sexual love, man for a woman. And there is another sort of love that I do want to discuss as we approach Valentine's Day. And that is the love for mankind, for your fellow men and women. And there's a very good example of that here somewhere in this group in this gallery, and that is, let me explain. About a month ago, the COVID vaccines came out, and us old folk here in South Florida were desperately trying to get appointments. And I gave up right away, but Jude stayed on the phone day after day. She was on the computer, getting nowhere. So she expressed her frustration to a friend of hers, and this friend of hers, who had having similar problems, has a daughter in Philadelphia. And the daughter in Philadelphia, is that Carol? Her name is Carol. She's in Philadelphia. Somehow she understands the system. Somehow she's a whiz on the computer. Within 2 days of contacting her, Jude and I had our first appointment, and we've now had both our shots. And we know about another 20 people here in Miami who Carol in Philadelphia has helped. And I imagine, in fact, some of them are all waving. And I imagine that this Carol is doing the same thing in Philadelphia and elsewhere. But this is a wonderful example of, because she doesn't know us. I don't even know if she's ever been to Miami, but whatever it is, she has produced wonderful, wonderful results out of pure love. And it's not only Carol, from what I gather, and again, I've never met Carol, but from what I gather, she's got her husband and her children, and they're all there with their smartphones and their iPads and whatever it is, whatever system she's got, the whole family's involved in getting us old fogies vaccine. So what I would like to do is raise a glass to Carol and all the generous love that she has she epitomized. Thank you.
Carol.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Carol.
So that's my bit done. Do we have any questions? Are there any anything that I can say before we? And Carol, are those your wonderful children in the background who have been helping us? Hi.
Past their bedtime.
Thank you.
Hi. Charlotte has gotten most of the vaccine. She's the quickest on the computer.
Oh, wow.
Well,
Thank you.
you've done a wonderful, wonderful job, guys. And,
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you so much.
Do we have any other questions from this evening?
Well, Patrick, I just want to say,
What's a secret of love?
I think you were right. We feel a lot better about our own relationship now that
Unless you're planning to kill your husband or wife. Maybe I'm.
hey, you've given me some
I don't
ideas.
think it's going to kill me tonight.
Well, you know, I could have started off talking about my own marriage with 50 years, but no one wants to hear about happy marriages. As Tolstoy said, all happy families, happy marriages are alike. It's the unhappy ones which are different and interesting, fun to talk about. So,
That's
but anyway, here's to my wife, Jude. Happy Valentine, everyone.
here's for your wife.
Oh, and there's and to my lovely grandchildren.
Yes.
Thank
So-
you.
And
Thanks
by the way,
for being able to connect with you. Owen and I are so happy to connect with you.
I don't think I can hear you.
oh,
Oh.
everyone's moving around. This is I don't know whether it's a
There's
wine.
the kid. There's the grandkids. Hi, Emma, Ivy. I love you.
So thank you all very, very much. I'm sorry to drag you away from the Senate impeachment trial, but we've been glued to that for the past few days. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and also the Liebestraum, the Isolde's aria over the dead Trista. And so I'm going to say, if there are no more questions, I'm going to say Happy Valentine.
Happy Valentine.
Valentine.
Happy Valentine.
Totally.